The Vesrec Tribunal's formal verdict arrived on Earth's diplomatic channel with clinical, bureaucratic precision. Humanity's atmosphere would be rendered permanently uninhabitable in exactly 400 days. A calculated consequence for territorial violations, the tribunal's considerable legal apparatus had determined warranted planetary decommissioning, rather than the more commonly applied economic sanctions extended to lesser offenses. It was, by every metric the tribunal's 300-year judicial history had established, a death sentence, delivered with the same procedural indifference the Vesrec Compact extended to every previous civilization whose violations had crossed the threshold requiring total planetary consequence. Humanity received the verdict, reviewed it for exactly 6 hours, and responded with a counter-transmission that would eventually be studied across compact legal and psychological academies as the single most confounding response in the tribunal's entire recorded history. A formal request for the precise time, down to the second, at which the 400-day countdown would officially begin. They are requesting procedural clarification regarding execution timing, reported Chief Adjudicator Vesren Colt, reviewing the human response with the particular bureaucratic bewilderment that had defined the tribunal's entire 300-year relationship with procedural minutiae. This is unusual. Prior verdicts of this severity have historically produced either immediate comprehensive appeal proceedings, or, in cases where appeal avenues have been formally exhausted, documented psychological collapse across the affected population's governing structure. Humanity has done neither. They have simply requested the exact countdown start time, with what our translation analysis describes as, and I quote directly from our linguistic division's report, unusual, almost clinical enthusiasm. The tribunal, whose considerable 300-year judicial history had refined planetary decommissioning into a process governed by exhaustive procedural precision, specifically designed to ensure absolute fairness regarding the exact moment. A civilization's fate became formally, irreversibly sealed, provided the requested clarification with the same bureaucratic thoroughness it extended to every procedural inquiry. Entirely unprepared for what humanity would subsequently do with that specific information. What followed, across the 400 days that Earth's population understood, with complete and unambiguous clarity, represented the absolute totality of remaining time before their planet's atmosphere would be rendered permanently uninhabitable, would become, within compact historical and psychological academies, one of the most extensively studied examples of a phenomenon researchers would eventually formally classify as deadline-optimized civilizational response. A pattern no previous species subjected to the tribunal's considerable judicial history had ever demonstrated at comparable scale. Day 100 Status Report, read the tribunal's own monitoring division assessment, compiled from extensive surveillance data gathered across Earth's 400-day countdown period, a monitoring effort the tribunal had authorized specifically to document what its own psychological research division anticipated would be the standard, well-documented pattern of despair, social collapse, an eventual resigned passivity that every previous condemned civilization had reliably demonstrated across 3 centuries of prior verdicts. Human civilization shows no measurable indication of anticipated psychological collapse pattern. Instead, surveillance data indicates unprecedented acceleration of coordinated technological and infrastructural development across every major population center, at a pace our comparative analysis indicates exceeds humanity's own historical rate of technological advancement by a factor our monitoring division's models cannot adequately explain through any conventional developmental framework. Dr. Amara Osai, appointed by Earth's unified emergency government as the primary coordinator of what human internal documentation referred to simply as the Deadline Project, would later explain, during formal testimony delivered to compact investigators years after the verdict's eventual resolution, exactly what humanity's specific psychological and cultural response to the tribunal's verdict had actually represented. "You gave us something your legal system apparently never intended to give us," she said, addressing a considerably more curious than adversarial compact investigative panel convened specifically to understand a phenomenon their own 300-year judicial history had genuinely never previously encountered. "You gave us a deadline. I don't think your tribunal understood, when it issued that verdict, exactly what that specific piece of information does to human psychology, because I don't think any previous species your tribunal has condemned processes time and mortality quite the way we do. Every human being alive has always been living under an eventual, absolute deadline, from the moment they're born. We call it death, and every human culture across our entire recorded history has developed elaborate psychological and philosophical frameworks specifically designed to help us function and build and create, despite knowing, with complete certainty, that our own personal countdown is always running, even when we don't know the exact number of days remaining. What your tribunal did, without apparently understanding the consequence, was give an entire species something we'd never actually had before at civilizational scale. A number, a precise, specific number of days remaining, shared collectively across every single person on the planet at exactly the same time. That's not a death sentence to a species built the way we're built. That's the most powerful motivational tool anyone has ever handed us, and we used every single day of it. The 400 days, documented extensively across both human internal records and the tribunal's own considerable surveillance data, produced a coordinated global technological and infrastructural mobilization that exceeded, by every measurable metric, anything Earth's own considerable prior history of crisis response had ever previously demonstrated. A pattern that would eventually force the tribunal's own psychological research division to develop an entirely new theoretical framework, specifically to account for human deadline-driven behavior. Normal bureaucratic and political friction that would typically slow major infrastructural or technological initiatives across a species, this politically fragmented essentially disappeared within the first 30 days. Dr. Oss explained during her extensive testimony. Competing national governments that had spent decades unable to coordinate meaningful joint action on considerably less existential issues suddenly found themselves capable of unprecedented cooperation, not because anyone suddenly resolved their underlying political disagreements, but because every single person involved in every level of that coordination understood, with complete clarity, exactly how many days remained before none of those disagreements would matter anymore. We didn't stop being human or stop disagreeing about plenty of things. We just discovered that a sufficiently absolute, sufficiently specific deadline has a remarkable way of clarifying which disagreements actually matter and which ones were mostly just habit. What Earth's 400-day mobilization actually produced, a fact that the tribunal's own considerable legal apparatus had never adequately anticipated given 3 centuries of prior verdicts against species, whose response to similar circumstances had reliably followed a considerably more predictable trajectory toward eventual, resigned acceptance, was a comprehensive planetary atmospheric shielding infrastructure. Developed and constructed across less than 14 months through a coordinated global engineering effort that compact technological assessment would eventually classify as decades ahead of what humanity's own pre-verdict technological trajectory should have made possible within any comparable timeframe. Day 390 status report, read the tribunal's final pre-decommissioning surveillance assessment, compiled 10 days before the scheduled atmospheric consequence was set to take formal, irreversible effect. Human civilization has constructed planetary-scale atmospheric shielding infrastructure sufficient, according to our own technical division's independent verification, to substantially mitigate the intended decommissioning consequence. This represents an engineering achievement our own technological development models indicate should have required, under standard developmental progression, no fewer than 30 to 40 additional years of continued human technological advancement. Humanity has apparently compressed several decades of anticipated technological development into less than 14 months, a rate of advancement our comparative research has never previously documented across any species within our considerable 300-year judicial history. Chief Adjudicator Vesren Colt, confronting a formal legal and procedural crisis, the tribunal's considerable 300-year history had genuinely never previously required it to navigate, convened an emergency session specifically to address a situation the tribunal's original verdict had simply never anticipated needing to account for. Our verdict specified atmospheric decommissioning as the consequence for humanity's violations, he said, addressing the assembled tribunal with genuine professional uncertainty regarding a procedural question its considerable legal apparatus had never previously required it to resolve. We did not anticipate, nor did our verdict's procedural framework account for, a condemned civilization successfully developing adequate technological countermeasures within the specified countdown period. I confess genuine uncertainty regarding how this tribunal's own procedural doctrine should properly address a circumstance our considerable prior 300-year judicial history has never once encountered. The formal legal resolution, eventually negotiated across several additional months of extended proceedings that would themselves become foundational precedent for subsequent tribunal engagements with technologically adaptive species, ultimately acknowledged what the tribunal's own considerable legal doctrine, however reluctantly, was forced to recognize as a legitimate, procedurally sound human response to a verdict that had, however unintentionally, provided the exact specific information a deadline-optimized species required to mount an unprecedented, successful countermeasure. This tribunal's verdict specified a consequence, and a specific timeline for that consequence's implementation. The eventual formal ruling stated, in an opinion that would become required study across an entire subsequent generation of compact legal scholars specifically studying the case. This tribunal did not, and could not reasonably have been expected to, prohibit the condemned civilization from developing legitimate technological countermeasures within that specified timeline, provided such countermeasures did not themselves violate any additional tribunal prohibition. Humanity's successful atmospheric shielding development, however unprecedented in its developmental pace, represents a legitimate exercise of the considerable time this tribunal's own verdict explicitly provided them. This tribunal did not sentence humanity to death. It sentenced them to a specific, calculated consequence, occurring after a specific, disclosed interval, and humanity's response, remarkable as it may be, represents nothing beyond the legitimate exercise of exactly the procedural rights this tribunal's own considerable legal doctrine has always extended to every civilization subject to its judgment. Dr. Amara Osai, reflecting years later on the specific psychological mechanism that had allowed humanity to accomplish, within 400 days, what the tribunal's own considerable technological assessment indicated should have required decades, offered a final reflection that would become, within subsequent compact academic circles studying human civilizational psychology, one of the most frequently cited principles regarding humanity's particular relationship with mortality and urgency. I think what your tribunal fundamentally misunderstood when it issued that verdict is something that's actually pretty simple once you understand it, even though I don't think any of us fully understood it either before we were forced to, she said. Every human being carries, somewhere in the back of their mind, the knowledge that their own personal deadline is coming someday, even if they don't know exactly when. Most of the time, that knowledge stays comfortably abstract, distant enough that it doesn't really change how we actually live our daily lives. But every single person who's ever accomplished something remarkable, against genuinely difficult odds throughout our entire history, has usually done it because something made that distant, abstract deadline suddenly concrete and immediate and impossible to ignore. A diagnosis. A war. A specific date circled on a calendar that suddenly matters more than anything else in their life. Your tribunal gave an entire species, all at once, exactly that kind of concrete, immediate, impossible-to-ignore deadline. And it turns out, when you do that to 8 billion people simultaneously, all of whom already understood, somewhere in their bones, exactly what a deadline like that actually means, you don't get despair. You get the most focused, most coordinated, most genuinely urgent 400 days of collective effort in our entire recorded history. You didn't give us a death sentence, adjudicator. Without meaning to, you gave us the one thing that's always, throughout our entire history, gotten us to accomplish things we didn't actually believe were possible, until we ran out of time to keep believing otherwise.